The study of textiles and the study of materiality are not the same thing. So the study of materiality, I would say, is very large, like all the materials that things are made out of. And textiles, though often called material, is a subset of that, right? And I would say that one of the things that is, has always been important to any field of art, no matter how you look at it, is that materiality matters. I mean, even a painter will talk about the way the paint feels on the brush, and like they may not belabor the point, and then some people focus on that, right? And and we can all be geeky about our different things, about the weave structure of a textile, or the what is it, a natural dye or is it a pigment dye, and all. We can all be geeky about those kinds of things, but what I'd say we share in common is this kind of language that can happen across materials, right? So there is a way that people know textiles. There is a way that people know the coldness of stone or marble. There is, you know what I mean? That there is something of the human endeavor in the manipulation of the materials, and not only our individual interaction with them, the artist's interaction with the materials, but also the audience's experience with those materials, and craft-based materials have a great impact in that way. People know how a coffee cup feels, so they know something about ceramics. Every day they do. And if it's a paper cup, they know something about paper. And this is the same sort of legacy of textiles that I'm talking about. There's an embodied knowledge there. So it becomes a place where you can really get right to a person in communicating to them about other things as well. And that's maybe where the psych major comes in, the psychology major comes in for me. It's like, how can I bring up a question or have a dialogue with someone through the materiality of an object? There's something very powerful about using a medium in which human beings are in constant contact. And through that medium, we have the ability to speak of many, many things. Now, of course, we're in constant contact of it with textiles because of fiber and clothing, but there's a way that our bodies know, there's a kind of embodied knowledge around textiles that's not about fashion necessarily, but just about knowing cloth. My grandmother was a tailor, and so I learned to sew at her knee. And I'm also very aware that a lot of people of African descent who came to this part of the world through forcible migration, the transatlantic slave trade, as my family did, to Jamaica and the other islands in the Caribbean, that here group of people who were more valued for their skill sets when it came to the technologies of the time, like weaving and sewing and basket making and blacksmithing, more valued for what they could do than who they were as human beings. And that is a sort of political way of framing the lineage that I come from. I decided to study textiles because of my connections to my ancestry. So my first degree is from Amherst College, and there I studied psychology and took a lot of classes in Black studies. And actually those two things are, in a strange way, what led me to textiles, because I was interested in how identity formation happens, how we come to know what groups of people we feel kin to, and how we identify ourselves within the context of larger communities. That's sort of a psychological way of thinking about things. And then Black studies in terms of a framework of understanding wide diasporic cultures those two things made me start thinking, okay, all right, and what are the material culture objects? What are the objects that give us a sense of ourselves and a sense of our culture? And my beloved, dearly departed parents, their gift to me from graduating from Amherst was to go to West Africa, to the Ivory Coast, to study textiles and culture and arts there for about, I think it was a month or 6 weeks. And as soon as I came back from that trip, I knew I wanted to go to art school because the things had sort of synthesized this idea of how textile practices are a way of understanding who and how we are in the world. And that's been a recurring theme in my work when I use textiles. In the case of this project, though, how do we understand who we are in a much larger collective way through cloth, right? And so that thread is running through, this conversation and through the artwork itself, So this idea that a monument would be something that is made out of a hard material, stone, metal, right? That was a kind of fixedness about it. It would be a certain size, or at least elevated on a plinth, so you have to look up to it. All right. So some of those notions about monumentality, they seem very limited to me, right? Certainly we refer to something being monumental in terms of its scale. So clearly we have that in this project, Monumental Cloth. The cloth is large.
All right, ready? Who's timing? Okay. Got a timer? Timer?
Nami, you're caught up on the thing.
Oh, thank you. All right.
Yes.
Is a monument something that necessarily has to be hard? Or is it something that is so large that it's present in everybody's mind? Like that's a way of being monumental, right? So in that sense, there's a way in which any symbol could be used because it gets dropped in the minds of many people as a monument. A logo could be a kind of monument because of its dispersal is so wide. You don't have to stand beside a big sculpture of some dude on a horse to say that's a monument. It's in your brain, it's in my brain, it's in my, so this idea of the disbursement as monumental, like living in each one of us, or just the many as monumental, right? So really even challenging that notion of what a monument is part of what this is. I mean, of course, straightforward sense, large, monumental, right? But pervasive is also a way of something being monumental. And I do think that this notion that something has to be hard is maybe a little bit misguided and Eurocentric. Because I think what it means is about how something endures. And the fundamental question in this project in Monumental Cloth is what endures and why? What symbols endure and why? I found myself at the American History Museum, the Smithsonian, looking at the section on presidents. And I see Lincoln's top hat, which we all associate with Lincoln. You see the top hat and you know the man, right? Again, this idea of symbol and clothing and the power of that. And then right next to it in the display case was this very humble looking piece of cloth, not very big, about this big, right? That had been clearly cut and then folded in half and then mounted. And it was called the Confederate flag of truce. And as I read it, it said this was the cloth that was essentially used to end the Civil War at Appomattox. Now, in this same building is where the Star-Spangled Banner is held. So here's a huge cloth, right, that has a song written to it, right, and is about this notion of American identity. And then tucked away in a dimly lit, it's got a room to itself and a long line, especially around July 4th, a long line of people coming through to take a look at the Star-Spangled Banner, Monumental Cloth. And then upstairs, tucked next to Lincoln's top hat, is the cloth that ended the Civil War, a humble, humble, small cloth. And it just became so clear to me that this cloth was at least as monumental as the one downstairs, despite its size difference, despite the intent of its production. One was meant to be a flag and the other one was meant to be a dishcloth, but got repurposed as a surrender and truce flag by the Confederate soldiers to essentially end the war, signal surrender, signal peace negotiations, signal a truce. And I had never seen this cloth before. Now, I'm not a historian, but I know the Star-Spangled Banner, and I certainly know one of the many Confederate battle flags. We all do. And we just, in short, call it the Confederate flag. And I thought, why do I know that one? And I don't know the flag that ended the Civil War. And that why led us to where we are in this project now. There are two pieces in that space. One is to take the humble dishcloth and expand it to 10 times its size. So now it's 15 by 30 feet. So it is monumental in terms of its scale. But then right next to it are ones that are true to scale, and there are 100 of them. So this idea of the many, so that again, that disbursement of seeing it again and again and again and again and again and again as a way of knowing. And so this project, I've been trying to think about how we know cloth, how we know symbol, and so that's why there are all these interventions of ways of knowing through understanding the texture of the truce flag by rubbing it so you understand that texture, knowing it so you understand the structure, so you have the opportunity, visitors and the audience have the opportunity to sit at a loom and try their hand at understanding the complexity, actually, of the structure of this humble cloth. Because it is actually a very complex, now I'm going to sound like a textile geek, but a waffle weave is actually a pretty complex structure. It's logical, but it's complex when you look at it. It's not easy to weave. So there's also this thing that I always think about in textiles, and perhaps in a lot of craft-based mediums, that they're the materials that we know the most, but we kind of overlook them. It's not a cloth of bold design in terms of its symbol. It's humble, it's off-white and it's got these 3 little red stripes. It's not meant to be seen across a battle flag, except that it's not a flag of bold colors and stripes. It was supposed to be just primarily a white cloth. That's the closest they could come to a white cloth. But it has this structure, it has this presence, it moved from domestic space to battlefield, and there's a lot of power in that. In one sense, it's so anti-monumental and simultaneously monumental that it gets into this sort of similar space of American identity itself. The great paradox of American identity being one in which liberty and justice live right alongside genocide and enslavement, right? So this idea of how can something be monumental and everyday? How can something be meant for the domestic space but end of war, right? And that same sort of pulse of like, how can both of these things live in the same space is actually part of American identity, as a parallel, right? So the reversals performance was not the first thing that came to mind. When the Fabric Workshop and Museum approached me and they said, do you have any ideas? I said, yes, I've been wanting to make this monumental cloth, the Confederate truce flag, for a long time. And so that was already in my mind. To be very, very frank, I had written a grant that I didn't get funded for, that I actually probably couldn't have done what the Fabric Workshop and Museum was able to do with a project here. So it's a good thing I didn't get the grant, because this was a better time and place to do that work. But I wanted to make a piece in the space here that connected to the African American Museum show, Self-Evident, that solo show that I have opening up in conjunction, that overlaps with Monumental Cloth here at the Fabric Workshop and Museum. And I knew that one of the pieces that was going to be in the Self-Evident exhibition was a piece that uses the Declaration of Independence, the text from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And of course, it's the next line that's so problematic, that all men are created equal. And of course, when that was written, they meant men, like no vaginas allowed. And they also didn't mean all men, because of course, African men were not even considered men, not even human. So we don't get far in the Declaration of Independence before, wait, there's a problem here. No women and not all human beings are, even gendered as men. They don't all count as men because of the color of skin and origin of birth, and subjugation, which of course had been happening for hundreds of years. So I wanted to do something about that here in Philadelphia. And the thing that seemed to make sense was to, since there was going to be a piece about the Declaration of Independence at the Self-Evident exhibition, to have a piece about the Declaration of Independence here as well. And how to tie it further to Monumental Cloth was to just, again, think about this reversal. Think about what would it mean in the consciousness of those of us who are here in the United States of America, if we have the truce flag in our mind as a symbol of reconciliation. Reversals is simply taking this notion of a dishcloth that became a symbol that brokered peace, and looking at all the ways in which the battle flag, the Confederate battle flag, has been used as propaganda. If you go on the internet, long, long lists of all the things that you can have emblazoned with this symbol that has been used for hate and white supremacy. And to reverse those two. So we bought a dishcloth. You can find them online. A dishcloth that is, again, emblazoned with a Confederate battle flag. And to use it for its purpose as a dishcloth, to clean up some mess. And the mess that I'll be cleaning up in this performance is the troublesomeness of those words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and actually it goes on to the first paragraph and ends in the word happiness. To think about how we still have a lot to do in terms of cleaning up this nation, so evident to us. I would say to some of us it's always evident, but it's daily evident to us that there's a lot of mess that needs to be cleaned up and reckoned with in this nation. And a lot of that mess is based on subjugation of people, xenophobia, white supremacy, its first cousin, white privilege, the way in which Black, brown, queer people are treated in this nation, I'm a child of immigrants, the way that immigrants are treated in this nation. It's just endless. And yet we think so highly of ourselves. We have a lot of work to do. So that American kind of exceptionalism is really problematic. And we need to work on cleaning up those words, really thinking about those words mean and how they come to mean something about our identity as a nation in all of its complexity as it plays out in all the individuals that make up this nation. So that piece is about this reversal, like this way of thinking about, these beautiful words that there's pride in, but really also problem in simultaneously. And reversing the idea of a dishcloth being elevated to broker peace and surrender and truce and reconciliation and forward moving, and what does it mean if we had gone down that path, right? Versus a battle flag that gets put on everything from bikini underwear to dishcloths to yoga mats. There's this iconic image that was taken by Gordon Parks, a fantastic African-American photographer, Gordon Parks, of Ella Watson. And many of us are familiar with this. It's a play on Grant Wood's American Gothic, and Grant Wood's painting, American Gothic, in which a white man and a white woman are standing, in this sort of farm setting, holding farm tools, right? And in Gordon Parks' version, it's a black and white photograph of Ella Watson, and she's single. She has an American flag behind her. She's an African-American woman who's wearing glasses. She is humbly dressed in a ill-fitting dress that she's clearly at work, and she's holding a broom. And as opposed to the pitchfork, I guess, that was in Grant Wood's painting. And I thought, that's the dress. Because there's something about that history, like you see that image and you think of Grant Wood's image, like simultaneously. They live together. And there's a story between them both and a dialogue between them both. And I think about all the work that African American women have done in cleaning up in this nation, and the pride with which so many women in the domestic space, especially African American women in the domestic space, they could both be in a role, they might be in a role of subjugation, but they're also in this role of potentially educating their children, supporting their families, like simultaneously, right? So it seemed like the right dress, the right cloth to put on for this overeducated professor to put on to acknowledge the legacy of all my ancestors who have gone before me, and collectively other women of color who have done the work to get me where I am, and also get this nation and all the dirt we have to deal with where it is. Now, I will say this, it is not the sole role of African American women to fix the problem of this nation, but it has been something that we've been working on for a very long time.